When I was 16, my parents kicked me out of the house to make space for my sister's newborn baby. I later made a post online describing how they had treated me over the years. After seeing it, my wealthy grandparents were furious and threatened to cut my dad out of their inheritance. That's when he suddenly started begging me to come back. I turned 16, and the first thing I saw that morning was an empty dining table. No cake, no card, not even a sticky note on the fridge. Just my mom's voice from the kitchen. Get dressed. We need to talk. There was no happy birthday, not even a casual, how did you sleep? Within 15 minutes, I knew I'd remember this day forever, just not the way I wanted to. I sat on the couch in an old hoodie, still shivering, from cold or nerves I couldn't tell. My parents were across from me like they were waiting for a lawyer, not sitting down with their daughter. They avoided eye contact, tossing lines back and forth. Mom said Tori, my older sister, was 7 months pregnant. I already knew that. The baby needs its own room, she added, like she was reading off a checklist, nothing more. Dad nodded without looking at me. Then came the line, "You'll be moving in with Aunt Carol." No questions. The decision had already been made. Nothing to discuss. I didn't cry. Maybe because I wasn't even surprised. I'd already learned how to be invisible. But the moment they rearranged my life like I was a piece of furniture, something in me quietly shattered. I asked why they couldn't just use the guest room. A few seconds of silence. Then Dad said Tori's boyfriend was living there now. I had no words. A complete stranger got priority over me. And this was how they chose to spend the day I was born. They offered to help me pack, so I wouldn't strain myself. I silently pulled out my suitcase. Dad loaded it into the trunk, and as Mom reminded me how great things would be with Carol, I tried to remember the last time either of them said something that sounded like love. Nothing came to mind. They were speaking to me like a tenant they were evicting, only this time they had an excuse. On the drive, they joked about the weather and discussed where to buy diapers, like I wasn't even there. I stared out the window and stayed quiet. Not because I was scared, I just didn't see the point in speaking. I didn't want to make a scene. I just wanted to disappear. When we pulled up to Aunt Carol's house, I got out first. Dad didn't even leave the car. Mom waved, "Don't forget to study." I wanted to reply, but I didn't know how. I just stood there as they drove off, like they'd dropped off a package and checked a box. Carol opened the door and hugged me right away. She was the only one in the family who ever genuinely asked how I was doing. Her home smelled like vanilla and coffee. There was a rabbit print throw blanket on the couch, and nothing was perfect, but it was warm. I felt something in me cracking open. Something old and tight that I'd held together just to keep pretending our family was normal. We didn't talk much. I just kicked off my shoes, set my bag by the wall, and sat on the couch. I turned on the TV and stared blankly at whatever was playing. Carol brought me some tea and left the room without saying anything. That was the best gift anyone had ever given me. I didn't cry, but it ached, like a dead tooth that hasn't started hurting yet, but you already know it's gone. I remembered making birthday cards for my parents when I was little, making them breakfast on their anniversary, buying Tori chocolate on bad days. And them? They didn't even ask if I was okay. They just got rid of me. For a baby I hadn't met and a man who wasn't even family. Maybe I really was old enough now. Old enough to understand you can't beg someone to love you. You can't earn someone's care. Sometimes you're just not wanted, even by your own parents. The first 2 days at my aunt's place, I barely left the room. I just lay on the bed, sometimes turned the TV on with no sound, sometimes read 2 paragraphs and forgot what I just read. It was strange not to fear footsteps in the hallway. Not to expect someone to burst in and yell about a dirty cup or that tone. I didn't need to hide, but I still did, out of habit. My aunt acted like I was just visiting. She didn't press, didn't offer forced comfort, didn't try to joke. She just made tea, left food on a tray, and said, "If you ever want to talk, I'm here." And that gave me more than my parents ever did. On the 3rd night, I finally decided to tell her what had happened. Not in anger, just the facts. She sat across from me listening, frowning at times but never interrupting. When I got to the part about the room, that I was kicked out for my sister's baby, she suddenly stood up and walked into the hallway. I stayed sitting in silence. A minute later, I heard her on the phone. Her voice was sharp in a way I'd never heard before. I couldn't hear the words, but her tone said everything. She was furious. I got up and cracked the door. Just enough to hear. She was saying, "You seriously think this is okay? Kicking out your own child for a boyfriend in a crib?" Her voice trembled, though she tried to stay calm. Then, "No, Jack, don't lie to me." I know she didn't ask for this. She was in shock. I stood there, pressed against the doorframe, my chest tightening. He lied. My father, her brother, told her I had offered to move out because the baby needed peace, and I was fine living with my aunt. That's why she welcomed me so calmly. She thought it was my choice. And he just lied, like it meant nothing. When she came back into the room, her face was red, her hands shaking. She looked at me and quietly said, "I'm sorry I didn't realize how serious this was. You won't go through this alone again." I promise that night I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling. The same thought kept spinning in my head. He didn't even blink when he lied. This had all been planned. I'd been removed from the house quietly, neatly, like an old piece of furniture. And even to his own sister, he pretended to be the good guy. The next morning, I woke up with a clear decision. If none of them cared enough to apologize or even admit they'd done something wrong, I would tell the truth myself. I took out my phone and started typing. At first, it was just facts. But the more I wrote, the more everything poured out. I remembered how my parents forgot about school meetings, how my dad said I was too sensitive when I cried, how my mom brushed me off when I asked her just to be near, how I'd spent years feeling like an extra. By the time I finished, it wasn't just a post. It was a release. I hit publish without thinking, and I broke down crying. After I hit publish, I just flipped my phone face down and walked into the kitchen. My hands were shaking, and my chest felt tight, like I hadn't just written a post. I had broken some unspoken family code. I felt guilty and free at the same time. And that strange mix made me forget the internet even existed for about an hour. I made some tea and tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting back to the phone on the table. It sat there like a time bomb. I was scared to look. In my head, I imagined the worst. People attacking me in the comments saying I was ungrateful or exaggerating. What if no one believed me? After an hour, I gave in. I picked up the phone, unlocked it, and froze. Notifications were pouring in nonstop. Comments, DMS, reposts. But the most surprising thing? Almost all of them were kind. Relatives I barely spoke to said they always knew my parents gave Tori more attention, and they regretted staying silent. A cousin from another state offered to let me stay with them if I ever needed. One uncle simply wrote, "I'm sorry. You deserve better." And somehow that was enough to make me cry again. I wasn't used to being seen. Suddenly, dozens of people were saying I mattered, that what happened to me was wrong. It was strange, moving, and a little terrifying. But with that support came what I had expected, messages from my parents, lots of them. First from Dad, long, angry rants with phrases like, "You embarrassed the family," and "Was it really that bad?" Then Mom saying, "You made us look like monsters." And finally, the line that broke me. Dad wrote, "Sometimes I wish you'd never been born." I didn't reply. I just blocked them both. I could feel the familiar, choking guilt trying to crawl back in, but I wasn't going to feed it anymore. I didn't owe them shame for telling the truth. My aunt noticed how tense I was, but she didn't pry. She just played soft instrumental music and suggested we go for a walk. We walked in silence, breathing in the cold air, and at one point she simply said, "I'm proud of you." That was it. That night, Tori messaged me. Just one sentence. "If you're open to it, can we meet in person?" No guilt trips, no explanations. I didn't know how to feel about it. We'd never been close. She hadn't been cruel, just distant. Always more important, more loved. I didn't respond. The next few days felt surreal. I avoided social media, barely looked at my phone. It all felt fragile. Like I was just learning how to exist without waiting for a door to slam or footsteps to chase me. Like I was waking up every morning in a world where I wasn't constantly trying to be invisible. And then something happened that I wasn't ready for. My parents showed up at my school. I saw them through the window as class ended. My heart jumped to my throat. I didn't know whether to feel angry or afraid. My friends, noticing how pale I'd gone, offered to stay close. And they did. We walked out together, and when my parents called my name, I didn't go over. But when they started raising their voices, I turned around, told them not to make a scene, to speak quietly. They didn't just look angry, they looked panicked. I realized they weren't there for love. They needed something. I agreed to talk away from everyone, just to understand what this was about. And that's when it all came out. My grandparents, my dad's parents, had seen my post. They were furious. They'd threatened to cut off my parents' inheritance if they didn't make things right with me. If they didn't show care, make peace. Because right now, Aunt Carol was the one actually raising me. and my dad couldn't afford to lose that money. I just stood there. They kept talking, pushing, persuading. I watched their plan fall apart in real time. And finally, I said, I don't care if you get your inheritance or not. I'm not coming back. Then I walked away. When I got back home after the scene at school, my aunt already knew. I didn't ask who told her. Maybe she saw it in my face, in the way I slammed the door, dropped my backpack, and just sat on the hallway floor. I wasn't crying or screaming, but something important had broken. Or maybe it had finally let go of me. She placed a cup of tea in front of me and sat down beside me. We sat in silence for 10 minutes. Then she said, I think it's time to talk about guardianship, if you want to. I didn't expect that. I'd been afraid all of this was temporary, that my parents could just show up and demand I come back. 'Cause a scene, pull some legal stunt. But she was offering to keep me. Not for a while. For real. I nodded. Too many words were stuck in my throat. But she understood. The next day, she started making calls to lawyers, asking how to proceed, what papers we'd need. It was strange to see someone actually fight for me. Not delay, not lecture, not ask me to wait for a better time. She just did it. While my aunt handled the legal stuff, I made a call of my own, to my grandparents. Until now, we hadn't been close. They lived in another city, only visited for holidays. But now they were on my side. And for the first time ever, it felt real. Grandpa said he'd already talked to my parents. He gave them a choice. Either give up their parental rights and let me stay with Aunt Carol, or lose the inheritance. Apparently, he'd shifted some assets around to keep that leverage. You deserve to live somewhere you're loved, not somewhere you're tolerated, Grandma told me. I cried, from relief. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Not as a burden, not as a problem to manage. As a person, their granddaughter, the girl they should have protected earlier. And even if they didn't, at least now, they were here. Dad didn't give up right away. He called my aunt several times, saying things had gotten out of hand, that family matters shouldn't be public. Once he even showed up outside the house. I was in my room. I didn't come out. My aunt stepped outside instead. She was back within 5 minutes and said, he won't be coming back. I made that clear. I didn't ask what she said. I believed her. Every day I started to believe this might really be my new life. Without them. Without the constant fear of being pushed aside, forgotten, discarded. Without trying to earn love I'd never get. I didn't have to perform anymore. I could just exist. I started breathing differently. Noticed how good the oatmeal smelled in the morning. How the sunlight touched the bookshelf. How peaceful silence could be when it didn't hide someone's rage. I did my homework at the kitchen table, sometimes played music. One day my aunt said, you're smiling again. I thought you'd forgotten how. And she was right. I had. The paperwork was nearly done when I got a letter from my mom. Not a message, a handwritten letter. 2 pages, neat cursive. She didn't apologize, didn't admit anything. She wrote that she didn't want to lose her daughter, that I was acting impulsively, that this was all a misunderstanding, that Grandma and Grandpa were pressuring her and Dad. I didn't respond. I knew that letter was filled with more self-pity than love. Aunt Carol gave the papers to the lawyer the next day. All we had to do was wait. The final say still rested with my parents, but they had a choice. Give up control or give up the money. And we both knew what they'd choose. For the first time, I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't see a girl someone could shove out the door. I saw a person, not a shadow, not an extra, not a burden, a human being. And if they hadn't realized that by now, it was already too late. The official letter arrived in the morning. My aunt handed it to me without a word, and I knew instantly. This was it. The documents were signed. My parents had given up custody. I was no longer their legal daughter. I stood in my pajamas in the middle of the kitchen, hands trembling as I held that piece of paper, and suddenly felt nothing. No joy, no anger, just a deep echoing silence inside. Like I had waited so long for this freedom, and now I didn't know what to do with it. My aunt hugged me, and I didn't even cry. I felt safe, grateful, but not light. I smiled at her as best I could and said, thank you. She didn't say anything, just turned on the coffee maker and set out my favorite mug. And somehow that was exactly what I needed. The documents were finalized quickly. My grandparents had already prepared everything. They gave my parents a clear ultimatum. Either give up their parental rights and let me stay with my aunt, or lose the inheritance. Dad chose the former. He didn't even hesitate, just signed and sent it back. Now I could legally stay with my aunt until I turned 18. The law was on my side. No one could force me back into that house, where I was never really a person, just a role to be filled. And yet, that night, lying in my new bed, I let myself think about what I'd lost. And it felt stranger than anything else. I thought it would be easy. That after all the years of indifference, the coldness, the words that cut deeper than silence, I'd feel relief. But it was more like standing on an empty shore, watching the last bridge burn. There was no way back now. Not ever. I was no longer a daughter. Not legally. Not in spirit. And even though deep down I knew I hadn't truly been one for a long time, it still stung. Because even when you aren't loved, some part of you still clings to hope. That one day they'll say the words, offer the hug, admit they were wrong, that you mattered. But they didn't. And now they wouldn't. The next day I didn't go to school. I couldn't. I told my aunt I wanted to stay home, and she nodded. I spent the day curled up in a blanket, scrolling through my phone, not knowing what I was even looking for. I read strangers' stories, looked at family photos, picnics, holidays, graduations, watched mothers and daughters laughing together. I didn't feel jealous. I just realized I had no frame of reference for what that kind of love felt like. Later in the afternoon, Tori texted. She asked how I was doing. No pressure. No expectations, just asked. I replied, I don't know. A few minutes later, she wrote, if you want, we can just sit together. No talking. I said yes. She came over that evening, brought hot cocoa and a chocolate bar, like I used to do for her when she was down. We sat on the couch without turning on the lights. I asked if she knew they'd signed the papers. She nodded. Said Dad had called her, complaining he couldn't watch everything fall apart. She told him nothing was falling apart. The truth was just finally being seen. We sat in silence for another 20 minutes. Then she said, you've always been stronger than they wanted to admit. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe that was true. After she left, I stayed in the dark for a long time, thinking how, from now on, I'd have to rebuild who I was. Not a daughter, not a victim, just me, from scratch. And that was terrifying. But maybe that's exactly where real life begins. Life without them felt like learning to walk all over again. At first, careful steps, tiptoeing, listening for every sound. Then slowly, more confidently. I started waking up without dread, having breakfast without rushing, playing music without checking if it was too loud. They were small things, but in my world, they felt like miracles. School changed too. I no longer hid in the library or feared staying late. I found it easier to talk to people. Some classmates came up and said they'd read my post. Others just nodded in quiet support. I stopped feeling invisible, or too visible. I just existed, and that was enough. My aunt bought a small whiteboard and we wrote life plans on it together. I'd never done that before. The word future always felt like a cliff edge. But now there were simple things. A trip to the coast, a new lamp for my room, a movie night. I looked at those notes like they were proof I could build something. Finally. I even picked up a small remote freelance job. Nothing major, just symbolic. But it gave me a sense of control. Not because I needed the money, my aunt and grandparents helped with that, but because I needed to feel capable of steering something, anything. And everything was going fine. Until the day Tori came over with that look on her face. She sat down and showed me her phone. A long thread of messages from our mom. And I knew right away. This wasn't good. Mom was writing about how things had settled, how she and Dad had changed, and now wanted to rebuild with at least one of their daughters. Just Tori, not me. The messages had this undertone of manipulation, praising Tori for being mature, understanding life, while painting me as emotional and stubborn. Tori didn't speak as I read. Then she said, they want me to move back in. Said they can't handle losing both of us. And in her voice, I heard something unfamiliar. Guilt. I wasn't angry. I knew how hard it was to say no to the people who raised you. Even when they'd hurt you. I knew how tempting it was to believe they could change. Especially when they put on that tearful, shaky voice performance they'd perfected over years. You don't have to choose, I told her. And I meant it. I didn't want to be the reason she felt torn. If she truly wanted to reconnect with them, that was her choice. But I also knew. They hadn't given up. They'd just changed strategy. Tori stayed the night. We didn't talk much. She said that since I left, she'd started seeing things more clearly. That our parents had always pressured her. That she felt like she had to be perfect because that's what was expected. That maybe that's why she stayed silent when they kicked me out, because she didn't know how to push back. It was strange hearing that. I'd always seen her as confident, grounded. But now I saw the same girl I saw in myself, just living a different version of the same story. The next morning, over breakfast, she said she wasn't going back, that she'd tell them directly, that she refused to be their PR redemption. I nodded. Not out of pride, out of respect. But inside, the old anxiety stirred. I knew my parents weren't done. If they couldn't use Tori, they'd find another way. Another path into my life. It burned them that they had no control. I didn't want to live in fear of their next move. But I also couldn't pretend this was over. They hadn't left. They were lurking, and I had to be ready for when they came back again. I thought they had finally backed off, that after losing custody, losing Tori, they'd realized it was over, that there was nowhere left to push. But I should have known better. People like them don't know how to lose. They don't accept it. They either control or retaliate. The first red flag was a call from my grandmother. It was late evening, and her voice sounded tired. She said she'd spoken to my father. He'd found a new way to push. Not through me, not through my aunt, but through them. Subtle legal angles, family guilt, heart-to-heart conversations that were just manipulations and polite wrapping. He wasn't pleading. He was accusing, saying they'd turned me against him, that they'd overstepped, that they were destroying the family. She asked me gently if I still wanted them to keep fighting, if maybe I'd rather just let it all go. And I felt something rise up in me. Not panic, not fear, something cold, solid. I'll talk to him myself, I said. The next morning, I called my father. For the first time, I was the one initiating. Not because I wanted to, but because I wasn't going to hide anymore. I wasn't the girl you could kick out on her birthday and expect silence. He picked up immediately, like he'd been waiting. I didn't let him speak first. I told him I knew what he was doing, that it killed him to lose control, that he didn't care about me or Tori or my grandparents, only about his image and his money. And if he ever tried to use any of us again, I'd tell the whole story. Not just to relatives, but online, with documents, with proof, with the voice I now had. He went quiet, the longest silence I've ever heard from him. And then he said, "You've really gotten mean." I almost laughed, because that was his confession. He knew he'd lost, and the only thing he had left was one last jab. Weak, pathetic. "No," I said. I just stopped being convenient. And I hung up. Later that day, my grandmother called again. She said she was proud of me, that things felt settled now, that she and my grandfather would stand by us no matter what. She sounded calm, but I could hear the relief. I had done what no one else in our family ever had. I hadn't looked away. That night, my aunt bought a cake. No occasion. Just said, "Things like this deserve to be celebrated." We ate it with Tori, laughing about something silly. And suddenly I realized I wasn't bracing for impact anymore. I wasn't flinching at footsteps or jumping at the doorbell. I was home. I always thought winning would feel loud, like cheers or triumph. But it was quiet, steady, like spring air after a long, punishing winter. You just breathe and know you can. But it also hit me that I would never be the same. Not in a bad way. I had grown, faster than I should have, deeper than I wanted. I could no longer just be someone's daughter. I had become my own person. And with that came strength. And yes, a little loneliness. But it was honest and real.